Okay, good. So I've been told essentially that most people have a very good functional knowledge of the SDGs. Is that true? And then we can kind of skip what the SDGs are and get on to sort of the more practical matters of what the hell now do we do with these big things. Yes. Good, excellent. Okay, let's crack on. So I think it's important to first start at an understanding of the differences between the old global goals, the MDGs, and the new goals, the SDGs. And there are several important differences. I'm sorry, I'm going to spin around a lot, so I need to look at the screen as well. The first, of course, is it represents a very, very significant political recognition of a shift away from the answer to the poverty problem being economic growth, growth at all costs, very much from the 1990s and 2000s Washington Consensus, Bretton Woods institutions, where a rising tide will lift all boats, and of course, if a GDP growth will trickle down to everybody. And of course, we haven't seen that happen. If only, in truth, what we've seen is rising inequalities. That was a shift away from that previous ideology to the answer to the poverty problem being sustainable development. That is massively significant. It's a very good step forward. However, now we need to turn that rhetoric into reality. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're going around the world to talk about these things. And we have to put our money where our mouths are on this topic. But it is very, very important. The second big significant difference is the SDGs have a much greater focus on the root causes of poverty. The MDGs were very much as much good as they done. They were very much a system of treating the symptoms of poverty. So it essentially was a system where we kind of created poverty through some externalities about environmental degradation, for example, rising inequalities and everything else, and then we threw money at it through overseas development aid to treat the problem. Now, with the SDGs, we are looking at things like environmental degradation, inequalities, and poor and lack of governance, amongst many other things. And really, at the end of the day, we will be treating the root causes of poverty before they even occur, which is a much, much more sophisticated, but complicated and challenging system. And of course, the big and third difference is that whilst the MDGs applied mainly to developing countries, it's a bit of a gray area here, the SDGs are truly global in nature and universal in application, which means they apply to all countries, developing countries and developed countries alike. However, they don't necessarily apply equally. How they apply is a question of great debate, but also of great interpretation. And I think every country now has a challenge of deciding the nature in which they apply the SDGs to themselves. Bearing in mind, and this is a very crucial point, the SDGs are indivisible. It's not an a la carte menu when you can pick and choose which ones you want to work on. Everybody has to do everything. But how they do it is another matter. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Oops, sorry. It is important to recognize intentions within the SDGs. And I should pause here to say I'm going to be a little critical of the SDGs. And I think it's very important to first recognize that it's a huge achievement. This is an excellent articulation of our challenges. And the fact that we even have these things is a huge step forward for humanity. So I think they're very good. They're not perfect by any means, but actually they're surprisingly good given the process that we went to get them in place. So everything I'm about to say and the criticism about the level, please bear in mind that I think it's a massive success story even to get to this point and have these things agreed. But there are some problems with the framework. As good as it is, it's not perfect. For example, and linking back to the other point around these root causes of poverty, if the SDGs are now about treating the root causes of poverty and eradicating poverty globally, we need to be sensitive and empathetic about people living in grinding poverty now. So we can't tell them, don't worry, we're now dealing with the root causes of your poverty, come back to us in 15 years and we will feed your family and you and look after them and everything else. So there needs to be a balance between, in the short term, poverty alleviation, to look after people in a true humanitarian sense, while in the long term, really focusing on truly eradicating poverty. And it's an exciting time. We are a unique generation. We have great power and we also have great responsibilities. We are the first generation that has the ability and the resources to eradicate poverty globally. We are also the last generation that has the ability to stop dangerous climate change. So we have to get this right. Sorry, I just thought. Even more so, come back, sorry. There is also a risk of policy incoherence within the framework. This is a massive problem that many of us, including UC, is very much working on at the moment to understand there are some inconsistencies. It was not designed as a complete whole framework. Goals were invented very separately and politically, and so some of them don't necessarily meet together, and some of the inconsistencies have not been ironed out. For example, we have a goal, SDG 8, on economic growth, and we have a goal, SDG 12, on sustainable consumption and production. We've never squared the circle on this problem. Can we have growth without limits? This is a question that goes back to the 1950s in the Club of Rome book report on this topic, and we've not figured this one out. Is a thing called sustainable growth possible, or is it just a paradox? That has not been agreed or discussed. Of course, politically, the politicians, the heads of state that signed this off, they wouldn't have signed up to it if they didn't have a goal on economic growth, because for political reasons they really want that kind of thing. So how does that fit against sustainable consumption and production? And there are other inconsistencies that we need to ensure we're coherent about. It is a very large and very broad agenda. It is also very vague. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. The ambition is good for the reasons that everyone in this room is very well acquainted with. I don't need to explain it. And the vagueness, however, is not necessarily a bad thing either. In fact, it would be a mistake if we were too prescriptive. It wouldn't have worked. Nobody would apply them because it would be too difficult. So we actually need them to be ambitious and vague. The challenge now is about translating into an appropriate national context for implementation, because these things will mean slightly different things to everyone. And I'll come back to this point in interpretation. It's very important. But is it communicable? Will children understand it? That's the true litmus test here, because that's what we have to get to. So we have to do better than this. And whilst the number of goals remains contentious, sorry, this is a bit of an old slide, they are not going to change. In fact, not only are they unlikely, they're done now. So we have to work with this very broad agenda we have and try to figure out a way to communicate it now further to the people with whom we work, which is not an easy challenge. And in fact, the communications angle is, I regard as a communications failure, in the sense that I estimate, which is a factor of 10 of the Maya World Survey run by UNDP and UN System, that maybe 100 million people in the world know about the SDGs, like kind of are conscious of them. That represents 1.3% of the global population. Everybody needs to know about these goals. These are global goals for humanity's future. We will have little success and we will struggle very much if we don't have greater knowledge of the goals. In fact, governments won't care that much about it if none of the public, i.e. the electorate, don't really know about these goals or care about them. So we all have a communications challenge here. We have to up our game. And we all have a role as an interlocutor or a champion of these goals. To go home, tell it to our friends, to our families, to our children, speak to people around it, and actually make it part of our everyday job. And lastly, another tension is there's a very big difference between what we call in the UN system the means of implementation, so how we propose to do it, and actual implementation, so actually bloody doing it. And there's always been a big cognitive dissonance in UN language about all these great intentions, and then people go home and they don't really see this turning into reality. We have to do this right this time. We do not have another 15 years to waste. So I'm going to introduce 4 key SDG principles and concepts to you. They will really underpin everything I'm going to talk about, and I think they're very important. The first 2 are really key principles. The second 2 are really more of concepts. The first one is around universality, and I think that, flip the next slide, please. This is trying to be embodied in one of our first reports. We've had a series now of 3 reports, which I'll go through very quickly to explain them all to you. I've been asked to try to do this, and you have one of them, I believe, in front of you, the 3rd latest one, which was commissioned by the Finnish government, the Ministry of Environment. But universality as a principle, as I've already discussed, is part of the SDGs. It cannot be stated often enough or more loudly enough. I believe it's very, very important to understand what this means in practical terms, which is why we wrote this report. But essentially, I think it represents a pact between developing countries and developed countries. If we as developed countries are asking developing countries to do something new and unique, i.e. leapfrogging and finding new pathways for development, not to do so the way we did, i.e. through rampant fossil fuel consumption and natural resource exploitation, then we are being asked by developing countries to do something significant ourselves in return. That is, to fundamentally change our socioeconomic lifestyles and impacts, to live better lives, more sustainable lives, less wasteful and less impactful lives. And if developing countries don't see us meaningfully doing this at home, i.e. implementing the SDGs, looking at what elements of the SDGs we can have the most transformational change to the world by incorporating these goals, I believe that developing countries will turn around and say, well, if you're not doing your end of the bargain, why are we bothered doing our end of the bargain? Because this is very hard. We're just going to develop the way you did because we want what you have, and we're going to do it exactly traditionally how you've developed and the pathway you took, i.e. through fossil fuel consumption and natural resource exploitation. And not only will the SDG framework collapse, which will be a waste of the last 5 years of my life, but the world will be going to hell in a handbasket very quickly. So universality really, really matters. It's important. It really will make the difference and will help us get the job done. So within this report, which we undertook, based on a challenge, we want to understand what is the transformational challenge for developed countries. What does universality mean for developed countries? And therefore, what must they do around the SDGs? To aid in this understanding, because universality is a kind of a vague concept, nobody really defined it very well. We just talk about it a lot. What does it really mean? How do you put that into practice? We came up with this Universality Triangle, which has 3 dimensions or 3 criteria. We then scored the entire SDG framework, just the 169 targets, against these 3 criteria. Each target we went through and said what we thought. And we used the United Kingdom as a proxy because, again, you have to be specific about the national context. Because when you try to interpret and implement these goals, you need to have a context by which you can do that. So the 3 criteria are applicability. So is it relevant to a country? Implementability. Can it be done with a reasonable amount of resources in a specific country? And transformationalism. Will it make a real-world material impact? Will it matter? So against those 3 criteria, we scored all the 169 targets, and that led us to this next slide. It's very small, I'm sorry, but it made the 16 goals, because we didn't work on goal 17, which is around means of implementation. We just looked at the more thematic goals. And interestingly, you see for developed countries, essentially the framework gets flipped upside down. So because the fact that the first half of the framework is really very much a continuation of the MDGs, they're still quite developing country specific. For example, we thought that goal 3 on healthy lives and promoting well-being actually scored the lowest in our analysis, because in many cases things like providing access to universal healthcare, that's kind of already being achieved in the UK and other countries. So they can rightfully tick off that one. So based on our methodology, our scoring system, we found that some of the more social goals, the MDG Part 2 goals, were less relevant and less transformational in their approach to developed countries, and that some of the newer goals actually have an opportunity for greater transformational change. The top 3 are climate change, energy, and sustainable consumption and production. And depending on how you define sustainable consumption and production, it should include renewable energy. So really those 2 goals merge under sustainable consumption and production, or SDP. And then of course, my argument is we believe very strongly that if you do SCP correctly, you will by nature tackle climate change. So we've kind of merged those. So we say that the most transformational challenge for developed countries is sustainable consumption and production. It's where we can give the biggest contribution to global sustainability. That led us to their next report, which was commissioned, I should say actually, the previous report on universality was commissioned by UNDP. This report was commissioned by the German Sustainable Development Council, and we tried to look at integration. Integration is another key concept that I mentioned, understanding how to provide integrated policy solutions. What's very unlikely what's going to happen is against 169 targets, you have a 1-for-1 ratio and you have 169 policies. Nobody's going to do that. That's too much work. So we need to find a way to achieve those 169 targets with about 10 or 12 policies. So they need to be integrated policies which deliver co-benefits and tackle and achieve multiple targets at once. And we characterize 3 types of integration to help us understand that. The first is does the SDG framework take a systems-based, holistic, systemic approach to understanding sustainable development? The very fact that the world is a complex, interconnected web, and therefore things are all interconnected. You need to see it as a whole system, not just individual silos. And where you do water over there, you do energy over there, and you do food over there. It's not the way the world works, even though that's the way we've designed our socioeconomic systems. So getting out of those silos. On the first point, we determined that actually the SDGs didn't really accomplish this first type of integration. But I slightly let them off the hook for it, because it was a process, a negotiation process of 193 countries, some of whom were literally at war with each other. So they actually didn't do a bad job considering the context. It would have been difficult for the smartest person in the world to sit in a dark room themselves and come up with an integrated systems-based goal or a goal-based package. So I'll kind of let them off the hook for that. The second one, the second type of integration, is about balancing the three dimensions of sustainable development, that is economic, social, and environmental, within each goal and within each target. And on this one, we found that they actually did a pretty good job. Most of the goals and targets have and do cover all three dimensions. Obviously, the social targets are going to be a little more socially focused, the environmental targets are going to be a little more environmentally focused, but they contain elements of all three dimensions. So on this type, we actually said reasonably well done. And now the third type is actually where it gets quite exciting. This is about interlinkages between goals and targets. So how does sustainable consumption production relate to a goal on, say, food waste? It's very obvious, but we actually have to find those explicit interlinkages. And that led us to our third report, which is universality and integration together. How do they operationalize those two very important concepts? How do we understand how they work? And therefore, how do we begin to even think about implementing the SDGs? So this report was commissioned, as I mentioned, by the Ministry of Environment of the Government of Finland. So thank you very much. It's just being launched formally this week, so you get a bit of a preview of the whole thing. We're very proud of it. It was really hard to write, I admit, but actually it turned out quite well. And in this report, what we were trying to do specifically is pioneer a methodology about A, identifying interlinkages, and then B, trying to classify the nature and strength of those interlinkages. So that methodology, which we prepared with bioregional and the University of Newcastle, led us to these findings. So this is the methodology in a nutshell, the top table, where you can see we found three types of broad categories of interlinkages, whether they are supporting interlinkages, so targets that support one another, enabling interlinkages, targets that enable one another, or relying interlinkages, targets that rely on one another. Within that, we subdivided it into 8 different types, and then in this report, we, just for sanity's sake, we decided the scope would be only the SCP goal, because we decided that was the most relevant to developed countries, as I mentioned. And we defined 23 interlinkages from the SCP goal, SDG 12, to the other parts of the SDG framework. So once we had the 23 interlinkages, we then went...
Sorry, can you speak a bit closer to the mic?
And I might have to tilt this up a bit. Once we had these 23 interlinkages, we then classified them against these types and scored the whole system. And you can see this was the frequency. And so you have 1 and 2 for the first category, 0 to 3, because we also have, crucially, a disabling. We found one interlinkage actually was detrimental. So again, this goes back to the policy incoherence point. And then 1 to 2. So for the most part, the interlinkages were of a reasonable high quality. They scored in the mid-range, so really more of the 1s and 2, and in this case, 2s than the 3s or 2s, the higher scores. So pretty good quality relationships between these things, but not as good as they could be. But the crucial thing here is once you understand these relationships, you can understand how to make integrated policy solutions. So for example, there is a target, I think it's 3.4, around food waste. Is that what we were talking about yesterday? You see, was that the one? Can I borrow the report for a second, please? Sorry, I'm just going to pause here, because this is actually quite a good example to actually explain this whole thing. It makes more sense this way. Sorry. Talk amongst yourselves. Oh wait, this is the old one. That's right. Never mind. Let's move on. Sorry, everyone. Bear with me. So, we found an interlinkage here, which is very strong. So it had a score of 6 between target 12.4 to achieve environmentally sound management of chemicals, and target 3.9, which is a health target, about substantially reduce the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals and air and water and soil pollution and contamination. So 3.9 is an outcome. It doesn't tell you how to do it. But what we found is, if you wanted to achieve 3.9, your best way to do it is to do 12.4 first. So there's a sequence. Because 12.4 says how to do it, whereas that one is just a target. So now you find these really unique relationships. In fact, if the health community wants to achieve this target of reducing deaths by chemicals, they should be speaking to this SCP community who have the best opportunity to help them do that, because they are the ones who manage hazardous chemicals. So these relationships, these interlinkages, help us decide how we're actually going to operationalize some of the activities to achieve these very demanding targets. And this study, I think, is the first one that in the world that begins to really have a robust methodology to help you even classify these things. Only then can you come up with a small number of integrated policy solutions which will help you deliver all the 169 targets. So it's exciting times. Next slide, please. There is a second half to this report. It's kind of a report of two halves and a bit of an amalgamation. There's very good reason for that, which I won't bore you with. But suffice to say, this then led us to the second half, where what we also tried to do was a bit of a mapping. So we took all of the targets, again under the SCP SDG 12, and we looked at the current indicators which are being developed. We tried to describe relevant EU legislation and policy for each target. We looked at the gaps and limitations of those policies in achieving that target, and we looked specifically also at who had the jurisdictional responsibility for that target. So where is the policy lever? So if you want to do this thing, if you want to achieve that target, here's what you currently have in terms of policy and legislation. Here's who controls the ability to make changes to that policy and legislation. And here's then what you must also be doing. So we made some commentary and recommendations. So this table is also something that's very unique in the world. Nobody's really begun to assign responsibility for the goals in a specific region or country. It's absolutely vital. How are you going to know how to achieve the goals if you don't know ultimately who's responsible for that policy area? Everybody needs to be doing this. So it's a good information source. It's not really truly a methodology, but the table could be applied by anyone to any part of the SDG framework or the entirety of the SDG framework if you really wanted to go crazy. Our next step in this report will be, this is a pilot. I think the first methodology, then this table will be harder to do, but certainly the top methodology on classifying interlinkages should be done for the entire SDG framework. So I'm hoping that this one will be quite successful and people will be beating down my door to give me funding to do this study across the entire framework. We'll see. And so then that took us on to the next slide, where we have some key findings. I have to say, I was less interested in the finding. For me, this report was all about pioneering a methodology. Of course, we had to then apply it, so we might as well produce the findings of that application. And I was very surprised. The findings were actually really so good that the methodology clearly works, and the findings were relevant and enough to actually discuss themselves and actually spend some time in the report really unpacking them. I won't spend too much time on this because you can read it yourselves, and you're not necessarily all SCP people, so they might not be overly relevant. But you can see from our methodology, we actually came up with some very specific findings. And these are just the one-line summaries. If you look at the report, there's about 3 or 4 paragraphs and very detailed text underpinning each one. But the point of all of this is, a methodology like this, it doesn't need to be exactly this one, could help policymakers, decision makers, civil society, private sector understand what the hell is going on with these SDGs, where they can make interventions to improve policies and activities to achieve the SDGs, and also what their role in all of this might be. And these kind of tools and methodologies are the way we're going to actually put some sense into what is, again, a very broad but very vague agenda. That takes us to the reason we're here today, which is, okay, that's all good stuff. Very cerebral, very intellectual, good policy, technical tools, but how do stakeholders truly get involved? And first of all, it's important to classify or define what we mean by stakeholders. It's a very vague term. So this is the broadest classical definition, which I referenced down there, which is basically anyone who's affected by anything. Pretty good, I guess. And Cranfield University actually classifies different types and characteristics of stakeholder engagement. So I've tried to just summarize it here for you. The three big types are crisis, whether you have no choice, you need to speak to other people because you don't know what the hell's going to happen, you need help urgently. That's the worst kind of stakeholder engagement because you're forced to do it. The middle type is more of a consultation, which is a bit passive, but getting towards proactive, and sometimes you might sort of anticipate things. You have it with regular intensity rather than continuous intensity, and it's a bit defensive, saying, we want to do this, what do you think about it, what's wrong with it? It's not the ideal, it's not the most sophisticated approach compared to collaboration, when it's truly interactive, it's encouraging, it's done continuously, and adapts over time. So really the aim is to get to a collaborative approach. Next slide. So what does all that mean in the context of the SDGs in terms of stakeholder engagement? I mentioned the fourth point of my 4 principles and concepts is around multi-stakeholderism. This is a very clear recognition, even by governments, that in the most progressive country in the world, public policy alone will be insufficient to meet the SDGs. This is a situation of all hands on deck. We need all sectors and parts of society coming together if we have any hope of delivering these SDGs. Therefore, the 4th concept I want to present to you is multi-stakeholderism. Why multi-stakeholderism matters? We have to incorporate it into our activities, otherwise I feel we'll have very little chance of achieving these SDGs. As Nelson Mandela said, of course in the context of apartheid, but I think it applies here as well, none of us acting alone can achieve success. Very relevant, I think, in this context, as it was, of course, for ending apartheid. So, of course, multi-stakeholder engagement will be recognized as essential for the SDGs, and that links to the 2nd principle I had up earlier, this idea of leaving no one behind. This is a very, very important thing. It links to this concept because, of course, if you involve everyone, you're less likely to leave anyone behind. And the overarching narrative of the SDGs is a document called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In the preamble for that, you will see this principle about leaving no one behind clearly written as one of the main objectives of this framework. So we have to figure out how to do it, but it's also very hard. And I'll come back to this point because what we need now is sophisticated data and measurement systems which we can then break down and disaggregate via different demographic classes and types of society for in the context of sustainable development. So not only do we not have most of the data and information sources for the SDGs at an aggregate level, just to say what a country is doing, we have no ability to disaggregate it down to these different demographic types. Gender, sexual preference, race, income classes. We have to be able to disaggregate it down to that level to be able to ensure that we are truly not leaving anyone behind. That's a huge challenge. The data challenge is going to be one of the most significant ones. Australia, about 3 or 4 years ago, in some early version of the SDGs, maybe about 2 years ago, they came out with a report saying currently, and they have quite a good National Statistical Office in Australia, they had the ability to report on about 60% of the SDG framework. That's Australia. Think about countries like Kenya or Tanzania or Malawi or Mongolia, where they probably had nothing to begin with on measuring sustainable development. This is a huge challenge. Again, all hands on deck. I'll come back to this point on data in a second. So really, stakeholders and the different roles they play, there's really 2 stages here. There's the design stage. So trying to create the SDG framework. There's an important point to make here, which is that in September. I was really one of the only people I heard saying this. But essentially in September, at the opening of the General Assembly of the United Nations, with all the heads of states came, and the Pope was there, and there was rock concerts and all these great things, and everyone was patting each other on their back for such a job well done. And it was, we have to celebrate our successes. But we were signing off an incomplete framework. The SDG framework is a goal, target, indicator framework. So far, we only have the goals and the targets. And as is so often the case, the devil is in the detail. And in this case, the details in the indicators. Again, I mentioned this is a very vague framework, so the indicators really, really matter. And last week in New York, the UN Statistical Commission had a meeting to discuss the proposed set of indicators underpinning these targets. So we have 17 goals, 169 targets, and now we have 231 proposed indicators. The indicators are okay. But because the SDGs were signed off at the heads of state level last September, I think we're going to need at least the General Assembly resolution to adopt the indicators, which means that won't happen until this September coming. So truly, we won't know the final SDG framework until a year after we signed it off. And then, those are just the global indicators. Every country, 193 member states around the world to sign up to this, will have to have their own national indicators to help them understand and report progress. It'll have to be a lot more broad, because actually the indicators that are being proposed are only really a high-level snapshot to give you a proxy indication of how progress is going against the targets. So really, we're a far way off until we actually get the full framework and truly understand what we're trying to achieve, what our ambitions are specifically at the national level. So there's a very key role for stakeholders in the design stage because it's still very much ongoing, both in providing expert input, but also raising ambition. I think the raising ambition part is very important because obviously at the UN level, in a negotiated process, the easiest way to get consensus is going to the lowest common denominator and weakening things down to the point that everyone doesn't care about it enough that, yeah, I'll sign that because it's vague. So we have to keep pushing and raising ambition. I think we did a very good job about that at the international, global level. We now need to replicate that at the national level when countries around the world are going to be making national policies about how to deliver these goals. Those policies have to be equally ambitious as the agenda is. So we still have key jobs to do on the design side. Then, of course, and then we move on to the delivery stage, which is essentially we're already into that stage. We are just over 4 months into SDG framework, 15 years. The clock's ticking. We got to get going. And I mentioned, of course, that we all have a key role on communications and awareness raising, so that's the first step. It's our job to spread the word. We have a key role to play in implementation in various roles. Some of us are more delivery agents than others, but regardless, we all will have some form of role about implementation. I think that's all for us individually to decide what that might be. I don't think you can be prescriptive about that. So many different stakeholder types. They really have different functions and roles, so it's hard to say much more on that. We have a key role to play in monitoring and review. It's a very difficult job in itself, because I mentioned the data challenges, but then even if you have the data, how do you report in a way that just the average person on the street can even begin to understand what's going on? Because if they can't, that's not openness and transparency. And lastly, on accountability, this is going to be massive. I think this is where we have an absolutely essential role. It's important to note here, the SDGs are not legally binding, at least not at the international level. They are a voluntary framework. So there is no legally binding accountability here. Therefore, we have to provide the accountability ourselves. So these were goals that were our governments went off and signed up to in our name. Therefore, it is our responsibility to hold them to account for progress on those reports. So for the lack of formal accountability, we have to invent new and sophisticated forms of participatory accountability, where we're all doing it together and holding governments to account, but also working with them and being accountable ourselves. Because if we are responsible for being part of the implementation, then we ourselves have to be accountable to each other. So you had a question.
When you say they are not legally binding, you don't mean that all countries that have ratified international conventions, the UN Charter, and human rights conventions are of course bound by the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals.
So those elements are.
You can't go to court, but you can't say they are not legally binding. They are very binding for most countries.
No, they're not. The conventions underpinning and the treaties are, but the goals themselves aren't. They have responsibility to achieve human rights and different treaties, but they could completely ignore the SDGs if they chose to. There's no repercussions, there's no enforcement. There's no, aside from naming and shaming at the global stage, there's no real impetus for people to have to do this, aside from goodwill. Conventions, treaties, even human rights, those are legally binding mechanisms. Okay, well, we can debate this some more. I'm quite happy to do so.
Economists normally don't understand this argument.
Well, I'm a policy analyst, but I would never say I was an economist. But I mean, it's very clearly recognized. But there are alternative means by which we can make these things legally binding. We talked about this yesterday. It's quite interesting. So whilst they're not legally binding, with obviously some footnotes around that, internationally speaking, any one country could choose to legislate for the SDGs nationally. So Finland could be the first country in the world, for example, to choose to legislate and put the SDGs into an act or a law. That would be amazing. I don't know of any country who's actually going down this road, but it would be a key mechanism to ensure delivery and accountability. And it would also provide continuity over the 15 years. Governments may change and come and go, policies may flip-flop, but it's very much harder to undo the legislation at the national level. Just a thought, if anyone's up for it, I think you should push for it. So, all of a sudden that takes us to delivering at home, as I call it. So what the hell do we do about all of this? We have all these roles and responsibilities as stakeholders. We have these huge challenges in front of us. How do we even begin to operationalize these things? These are just my 5 quick thoughts of certain things we must now do if we have any hope of delivering against these SDGs. I should say this is not a comprehensive list. There's probably many other things that need to be done, but I would say these are some key essentials. The first being, we have to improve governance and legislative mechanisms. That being said, I think Finland has some of the best sustainable development governance mechanisms in the world. I studied this a lot. Sustainable development governance is my bag. I love it, so this is my area of expertise. And I think Finland's very in a very good place, and you have processes already in place to even improve on what you currently have and go further. So I think Finland's in a good place, and a lot of other countries can learn from the Finnish example. Of course, we need to model new and better processes for engaging all stakeholders in the sustainability transition and embody the leave no one behind principle. Again, I think Finland's doing pretty well on this. Yes?
Could you just specify for the Kenyan?
Oh, of course, group? Yes.
They want to know what strategies has the Finnish government put in place for the implementation of SDGs?
Okay, so Finland has been doing very much good work over many 20 years. I think you have had 4 or 5 national sustainable development strategies over the last 2 decades. Currently, the current one is from 2014, and it's called Finnish Society's Commitment to Sustainable Development. And it's a very much an alternative approach to most of the national sustainable development strategies in the world. Most national sustainable development strategies I've seen, and I've reviewed quite a few of them, are very much more of a government white paper top-down approach, where government just writes something, they may consult stakeholders, it might be inclusive, but it's really just, here's what we're going to do as a country, and everyone just get on with it, and it'll sort of trickle down and pervade all aspects of society. Finland's done it in the opposite way. They've done a huge stakeholder consultation, helping people define the whole thing, and then from a bottom-up approach, they've then turned that not into a strategy, but a commitment by society to sustainable development. I think it's a very unique, innovative approach. It's really got a lot of buy-in, and I can even say, for example, that approach is, I think, pervaded Finnish society better than anywhere. And I used this example yesterday, and I might as well whip it out again. On the plane here, I never really do this, but I decided to read the in-flight magazine. Blue Wings, Fin Air. And I was reading it, and I was so impressed. I had to keep flipping to the front cover to see if it was a special issue on sustainable development, but it wasn't. There was 14 separate articles about all manner of topics around sustainable development. It was just integrated. It was just part of Finnish society. It just We just do sustainable development. Anything from hospitality and travel, to food, to soap, to industry, to corporate reporting and responsibility. It was amazing. I was very, very impressed. And I think that is a clear, pointed outcome of this Finnish approach, the Finnish commitment to sustainable development, where companies and organizations and civil society bodies have really signed up to that around some basic principles. They really seem to be adopting it. I was very impressed. And I thought this was a very acute example of the success of the Finnish approach. Yes, so we need to engage all stakeholders. I'll come back to that point as well, but very briefly. The process to decide and to agree the 2030 agenda and the underpinning SDGs is probably the most inclusive and participatory in humanity's history. More people were involved in this than probably any other type of policy framework set up. It's been amazing. That has been the spirit and intent of the whole process all along. I think the government, the UN, has done a marvelous job of making sure they kept things open. There was crucial stages where we thought the doors were going to shut on our faces and we would be kicked out of the room so governments could negotiate alone. We, amongst many other NGOs and stakeholder bodies, fought very hard to keep open, and governments listened to us and they kept the doors open. We were always there. It was great. However, that needs to be continued because now that dialogue is going to be down to the regional level and the national levels, and that same spirit, ethos, needs to be continued for openness. I'll come back to that point because otherwise I don't think you could really regard these as good governance in terms of the design of the next stages of SDG implementation. Of course, we need to either create or renew, as is many of the cases where there's already existing things, regional, national, and local sustainable development strategies or frameworks. And again, I don't think we should be prescriptive here. I think every country, every region just decide what's best for them. Some countries may really go for a traditional white paper, national sustainable development strategy report. Some people might go for more sophisticated, but sort of more tailored SDG delivery plans. Finland has its society commitment, which is more of a bottom-up approach. There's a matter of things here, but it's essential that every country has a very open and transparent plan of some sort in place about how they're going to deliver the SDGs at home. It's very essential. In the UK, there is nothing. It's impossible to hold the government to account. We have no idea what their plans are. They're not sharing anything. It's all very behind the scenes, closed door, and it's a struggle. And, of course, we need to review and update policies and delivery programs. One of the key steps, and what's going on here in Finland, amongst many other places, is in the first instance a mapping. So taking the 169 targets of the SDGs and saying these are the existing policies and programs we currently have, which could be harnessed to deliver each one of these SDGs. That will also help us identify where are the gaps, where we need new policies, where nothing exists now. So the mapping exercises are going to be very, very important as well. So how then do we update those policies based on that mapping to make sure that existing policies are fit for purpose for the job of delivering the SDGs, and we can design new, sophisticated policies or programs to fill the gaps where there is nothing currently in existence. And lastly, of course, we need to really do better on education for sustainable development. Formal and informal education around the SDGs will be essential. And I include, as part of that, of course, this idea about communication and awareness raising. These are my 5 essentials. Next slide. This is kind of my thing. I mentioned the governance in my bag. I really love it. I have tried to define 10 governance elements that really help us understand how we put in place the architecture at any level, international, regional, national, even local, to help us begin to look at the core architectural elements that we need to put in place to truly be good at delivering sustainable development. I won't go into a lot of detail here. It's pretty self-explanatory, but certain things need to happen together. For example, there's no point in doing stakeholder engagement if you haven't created the right institutional arrangements so stakeholders can then engage. So once their capacity's been built, they've got the information and awareness, they've been asked to participate, if there aren't no modalities or proper institutions with whom to engage, there's very little point. So this is an indivisible program. And of course, this idea of conceptualization and decision making is exactly what these reports I've been talking about were all about. So they're not really thematic reports in the sense that I'm just trying to help people understand how to make better decisions. I'm not telling them what to do necessarily. All that's linked to the need for greater vertical alignment, which again, we need to see this as a whole. We've got these goals agreed at the international level. We now need to sink those down to the regional level. So what is the EU as a whole going to do? What are the 23 EU member states going to do? And if you have a bit, there's common alignment structures: vision, goals, strategies, and implementation. So the vision is the 2030 agenda. The goals are obviously the goals. The strategies are these national sustainable development strategies or development plans or councils, and then implementation is national policy down to local delivery programs. This structure is very important, and crucially, this red arrow is the feedback loop. All that needs to go back up to the international level, so we can share good practice and experience and understand what's going on elsewhere in the world where we can learn from other people. Again, Finland is doing great work. That should definitely be showcased. Finland is one of the 22 countries who volunteered to do the first reporting this year at something called the High-Level Political Forum, which is essentially the institutional home for the SDGs within the UN system. And so really it's great that they've stepped up, because I think you have a lot to share with the world, but at the same time there's probably other creative, innovative things going on elsewhere in the world which Finland could also probably adopt and even go further in your great work. Another key thing, this is from an old report from the old UK Sustainable Development Commission. So we used to have something very much like the Finnish National Sustainable Development Commission. We were axed in 2011 when the new government came in, and this is a subject that's very dear and sort of my heart. So I spent 5 years there, including till the final day, and we launched this report on the last day. This is my last report, in which we said an open letter to future governments of the UK, and it's called Governing for the Future. And we pioneered this policy cycle to help understand what are the architectural components of good sustainable development in government. And what we found actually is, whilst you might have governance arrangements, you might have mechanisms for policy making, monitoring, reporting, ultimately this is all driven by two key enablers. They are stakeholder engagement and capacity building. And if you don't do those two things, everything else is a struggle. So this was just a snapshot, of course, there's a whole report based on this thing, and I just wanted to show you that in our findings, we found stakeholder engagement and capacity building to be these key enablers of everything else in terms of good architecture for sustainable development. So specifically, what does stakeholder engagement, what is the role of civil society in this whole thing at 3 different levels: UN, EU, and national levels? So I'm just giving you some snapshots here. Of course, again, this is not exhaustive, but it gives you at least an understanding of where you might begin to put your efforts in terms of helping to deliver the SDGs. The first thing is, of course, we have in the UN system something called the major group system. There are 9 major groups. They are essentially the mechanism by which stakeholder engagement and coordination happens at the UN system. Different for different parts of the UN system, but this is more for the sustainable development processes in New York, and it's similar to the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in Nairobi. They both use this structure. 9 major groups. I'm going to try to recite them, so someone might have to help me out here. But it's women, children, farmers, trade unions, NGOs is some weird catch-all for anything that doesn't fit anywhere else, business and industry, indigenous people, trade unions, and science and technology. So those are the 5 sort of classifications, but it's not without its problems. There's a lot of criticism that many certain groups have been left out. For example, LGBT is not really defined anywhere. Disabled people aren't really sort of given their own sort of specific thing. Educators and academics feel very strongly that they should be their own sort of constituency. The other one is volunteers have been advocating very hard for reading these things. So they really now need to review and enhance the suitability of this major group system in the context of this new agenda in order to promote effectiveness and inclusivity, because many people feel left out of it, and sometimes people like LGBT are just told, well, just join the NGOs, because that's where, if you don't belong anywhere else, you just fit in with the NGOs. But they feel they have their own obvious identity and that they are therefore. So there's a need now to review that system to make sure it's fit for purpose as well. We need to ensure the high functionality of this new high-level political forum. This was another outcome of Rio +20 along with the SDGs, it's a mediocre setup. It's not a body, it's not an institution, it's a forum. It's kind of just more of a process. Essentially, it meets every year at the ministerial level, and every fourth year it includes heads of state level. But it doesn't have a secretariat, it doesn't have its own budget, it doesn't have any programmatic work. It's just kind of a talking shop. I don't think it's very good. And this was actually the successor body of the Commission for Sustainable Development, which was closed at Rio +20, and then they invented this. I personally regard this as a step down. Although the CSD, the Commission for Sustainable Development, was fraught with problems by the end, this, I think, is still better. So, however, there is in the resolution that established it, Resolution 270-690 or something like that, there's an opportunity to review the whole system in 2019 when the next heads of state meeting will be in the HLPF, and that's our opportunity. I think we need to be working towards that to decide what do we really want. I don't think the system's great.
Thanks. So there's a question here.
Yes, please.
In the Tanzanian group, there are a lot of youth participating in the website seminar. So they wanted to know a bit more about the youth major group, that how powerful it is in influencing the decisions.
Actually, very powerful. They, along with women, are one of the most proactive of the major groups. They're maybe not very well resourced, but they are certainly ambitious and keen, and they come up with some of the best statements of the major groups that I've seen. They are very well organized, and they're always looking for new members. So if anyone's interested, go to the UN website. I think it's Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform.un, and you can find all the information on the major groups there, or just Google UN major groups and you'll find it. And they would love to get more members, particularly in Africa. I know that for a fact. The big problem, of course, is that they don't really have resources. So quite often, it's people, these young people, having to pay for themselves to go to New York. So quite often, what you get is Northern Europeans and North Americans and people from developing countries, particularly the youth, are not necessarily included. So it's a shame, really, and there should be more resources for all of the major groups to be more involved. But of course, we know there's massive cuts going everywhere in the world, including in the UN system. So we've had programs in the past to support the major groups, but at the moment, we, Stakeholder Forum, don't have one. And the system's there. So I really would encourage them to reach out to the major group organizing partners, OPs. So each major group has 2 or 3 OPs. If you contact them, they can give you more. They can give everyone more information about how to be involved.
Definitely, they provide quite a lot of useful material.
They certainly do, yes. So, where were we? And the last point on all of this UN level will be the critical importance of establishing appropriate rules and procedures and informal understandings, i.e. modalities for engagement. A lot more could be done. The system's not bad, but it really could be improved. The big problem is many different parts of the UN system have their own rules and procedure for engagement. So if you're in one forum compared to another UN forum, things might be radically different, and your rights and abilities to participate might be quite different. And it's a very, very esoteric system. You know, people spend their whole careers just trying to understand these things. So it really could be A, simplified, B, more enhanced. So there could be more greater involvement, and it could be easier done. So there's still a long way to go. We shouldn't rest on our laurels. And yes, this whole SDG process was the most inclusive in humanity's history, but that doesn't mean we can't do better. We need to do better, because my firm belief, the basis of Stakeholder Forum, is that the more open and inclusive and participatory decision-making processes are, the better, more considered, and more profound the outcomes will be. Those outcomes will lead to bigger and better impacts. So opening the doors can only be a good thing. So what must happen at the EU level? We feel very strongly that the EU must develop a common implementation plan for the SDGs, understanding, of course, these jurisdictional responsibilities that I mentioned beforehand. That will massively help the member states. Right now, 23 member states in the EU, they're all off doing their own thing, deciding how they're going to deliver the SDGs. The EU itself needs to come out with a plan very quickly, so that everyone's not doing something very random, that there's coordination. It's a real risk. They have to get their act together. They've been talking about for a while potentially having a new EU Sustainable Development Strategy. The process might begin in 2016. We're not sure yet. There's still a lot of debate. I know, again, much like the UK, the EU has been doing an internal mapping exercise for nearly a year now, and we've not seen any results of it. I really tried quite hard to get them to give us this just for this report, because it would have saved us a lot of time, but they wouldn't share any of the details, and we don't know why. And so I think it's a real problem, because really when you've got 23 countries deciding their own plans, but they're part of a regional coordinating mechanism, they'll have to redo those things once the EU says what it's going to do. And it's a bit of an inefficiency. So really the EU needs to step up and be very clear very quickly about how we do this together. Because much of this work is transboundary environmental issues, for example, and we need this higher level of coordination at the regional level to achieve the SDGs. Of course, we need to find a process or a mechanism for reviewing and monitoring and reviewing of progress regularly. That needs to be part and parcel of whatever the EU says. That would be very important, because really at the end of the day, we need a sophisticated ability to roll up all of this massive amount of data that I've mentioned before, disaggregated at the national and local levels by all of these different demographic classes into a national report, 23 countries in the EU rolling up to a regional report, 193 countries in the world rolling up to a global report. And we need to be able to unravel that and roll it back up as quickly as we want. It's a huge undertaking itself, just the reporting aspect of it and the ability to aggregate and disaggregate very quickly. So it has to be coordinated. We can't just let everyone go off and do their own thing, because then we'll be in a situation of a high degree of incompatibility and incomparability. That will be a dangerous situation to be in, because we won't be able to aggregate the information to get a true global picture or even a regional picture. So we have to be better at coordinating, and I think regions around the world, all of them, not just the EU, need to come up with certain implementation plans and these coordination plans urgently. And of course, again, blah, 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 we need to engage stakeholders in all these processes all the time. Next slide, please. One of the reports that we did actually is called, sorry, it's fuzzy, it's called Building the Europe We Want, Models for Civil Society Engagement in the Implementation of the 2030 Agenda at the EU level. This was commissioned by the European Economic and Social Council. We wrote a report, it was quite good. One of our key recommendations was that in addition to, of course, these national sustainable development councils and commissions, we should have a European Sustainable Development Forum, which meets regularly, where people can come together and talk about these things at that regional level. So this is being taken forward as a recommendation. It's being slowly developed by the EESC. Whether it will have any traction across the broader European Commission is yet to be seen, but at the moment there is no such forum for us to get together as stakeholders, European stakeholders, to share information and intel in a sophisticated manner or a very common platform. So something like this might actually be absolutely essential in helping us do our jobs and coordinating better. There are, however, initiatives and programs and organizations that are already doing this to a great degree. For example, Concord does great work in coordinating stakeholders to EEB. There are other ones. There's what was Beyond 2015 is still kind of kicking around, and there's new versions of it. But ultimately, those are civil society-based initiatives, and we need something that's a bit more formalized to ensure good interface with governments as well. And so I think it's very important that we come up with something formal as a mechanism, in addition to the informal mechanisms that we already have. Okay. Now, that brings us to the national level. What are we going to do, again, at home, as I mentioned? So I mentioned these 5 essential elements and trying to turn them into sort of something else. What we found in our analysis, specifically from this report I just showed you, at the national level, certain things need to happen. We noted that better progress has been made, as in the case of Finland, when true engagement results in combined bottom-up and top-down approaches, i.e. when a national sustainable development is complemented by a societal commitment. Countries who do that sort of arrangement seem to have had the best success in achieving or progressing towards sustainable development. So you can't really just do top-down or bottom-up alone. You have to be seen as a joint effort to go forward. Engagement must be continuously maintained at all stages. everything in that policy cycle I mentioned, from policy analysis or problem analysis to the co-production of strategies and plans, through to partnerships for implementation and monitoring. Stakeholders must be actively involved in regular cycles, so they actually have a clear indication of when they're expected to comment and input and ask for their own reports of progress. So they can prepare appropriately and they're resourced to do so. It's not fair to necessarily ask all of civil society to contribute, but then not give them any resources to do so. And of course, this concept that I mentioned earlier, participatory accountability, is going to be absolutely essential, particularly in the context of the input of stakeholder expertise. So there is a lot of what we call unofficial data out there. So again, if we have this huge data gap where national statistical offices don't have all of the data available via official data sources, we have to begin to unlock unofficial data sources. Private sector companies will have reams of information. Academics will have been collecting information for a long, long time, and all that needs to be identified, quality assured, and then harnessed into this reporting. And I think it will help us go a long way in filling that data gap that we've already identified. And that's it. So thank you very much, and maybe we can have a nice conversation. How is that time? Are you okay?
Yes, we are fine.
Yes, somewhere we are fine. And also they are asking for the break so that they can have the discussion. They were a little bit having troubles to follow the news stream at the end, towards the end. At least the Kenya group sort of got for the last 5 minutes.
I'm sorry.
But it's okay. That will catch up during the break. I suppose the Tanzania group was able to follow us all the time. So I suggest we do a round of discussion here in Finland, and then we break for coffee, and then I'll try to see what is going on in the other two places. So
Great.
if we disconnect the Ustream, and I will connect the Skype so they can hear us, perhaps not well, but let's see.